A Pair of Schoolgirls by Angela Brazil. Chapter 13. A School Anniversary. Dorothy returned to Hereford with a whole world of new experiences to relate to Aunt Barbara. The visit to Ringboro had indeed been an immense enjoyment, and after so much excitement it was difficult to settle down to the round of school and lessons. With some nature's change is a tonic that sets them once more in tune with their everyday surroundings, but with others it only rouses desires for what they cannot get. Unfortunately it had this effect in Dorothy's case. Her pleasant time at the Hydropathic, the amusements there, and her companionship with other young people, which she had so much appreciated, all combined to bring out into sharp contrast the quietness and uneventfulness of her ordinary existence, and to make her life at Holly Cottage seem dull and monotonous. The old cloud settled down upon her, and the old discontented look crept back into her eyes. Aunt Barbara, who had hoped the holiday would cheer her up, was frankly disappointed. She was uneasy and anxious about Dorothy. She felt that some undesirable element was working in the girl's mind, yet she could not define exactly of what it consisted. It was a negative rather than a positive quality, and manifested itself more in acts of omission than those of commission. Dorothy was rarely disagreeable at home, but she had lately slidden out of many of the little pettings and fond, loving ways that had meant so much to Aunt Barbara, and her manner had grown somewhat hard and uncompromising. Small things count for so much in daily life, and Dorothy, absorbed in her own troubles, never thought what value might be set on a kiss, or what the lack of it might seem to that tender heart which had made her happiness its own. At present she was engrossed in Avondale concerns, for the coming term as the fullest and busiest in the school year. Not only was there the work of her own form to be considered, but the many side interests in connection with the college also, the Ambulance Guild, the Botanical Society, a special feature of the summer months, and last, but not least, the Dramatic Union, to be a member of which she was justly proud. Her inclusion in this, though a supreme satisfaction, brought the penalty of added work. She was expected to learn parts and submit to severe drilling at rehearsals, the standard required being greatly above what had contented the upper fourth. The Union was looking forward to shortly displaying its talent on the occasion of the school festival. This was to be held on the 12th of May, partly because it was the anniversary of the laying of the foundation stone of the present building, and partly because, being Old May Day, it gave an opportunity for many quaint and charming methods of celebration. Miss Tempest, who loved to revive bygone customs, had introduced maypole plaiting, Morris dances, and other ancient joyous devices at the school, and the girls had taken them up with enthusiasm. At this festival, instead of giving dances and May Day carols, such as had been popular for the last year or two, the Dramatic Union was to act a floral pageant called the Masque of the Blossoms, a pretty performance in which interesting old catches and madrigals were included, and many historical and emblematical characters represented. Miss Hicks, the singing mistress, undertook the direction of the musical part of the piece, and coached the girls at private practices in the songs. Dorothy, after the allotment of the parts, came home brimming over with excitement. "It's the most delightful, quaint thing, Auntie. Queen Elizabeth is in it, and Raleigh and Spencer, as well as Venus and two nymphs, and the spirit of the woodlands. The songs are charming. I know you'll like Now is the month of Maying and the trees all budding. Nora Burgess is to be leader of the masque, and Ottilia Partington is Spring. And oh, Auntie, what do you guess is my part? I'm Obie, Queen of the Daffodils." It lay between me and Vera Norland. We both knew he words equally well, so we drew lots, and I won. "I've brought a book to show you what the costume must be. Look. It gives a picture. It's extremely pretty, but it seems rather elaborate," said Miss Sherborne, scanning the dainty creation figured in the illustration with an eye to its home dressmaking possibilities. "Do you think so? The green part's to be made of satin, and the skirt underneath is all folds of soft yellow silk, to represent petals. Then there are wreaths of artificial daffodils, and a veil of gauze covered with gold sequins. Perhaps we can copy it in sateen and art muslin," said Aunt Barbara. "Auntie, it ought to be real silk and satin. It won't look anything if it's only made of cheap materials. But I can't afford to buy dearer ones for a costume that will only be used once. Muriel, and Fanny, and Olga, who are taking the other flowers, are having beautiful things made at a dressmaker's," returned Dorothy rather sulkily. "I dare say, but that doesn't make it any easier for us. I can't be the only one in a cheap dress," burst out Dorothy. "Oh, Auntie, you might let me have something nice, just for once. It's too bad that I never get anything like other girls." "You don't know how you ask, Dorothy," said Miss Sherborne, with a pained tone in her voice. "I do all for you that's in my power. It hurts me to deny you even more than it hurts you to go without what you want. No, I can't promise anything. You must learn to realize what a small margin we have for luxuries." Dorothy flung down the book and rushed upstairs to her bedroom. She was thoroughly out of temper, and hot tears started to her eyes. She had set her heart on making a good effect as Queen of the Daffodils. It was an important part in the masque, and she was extremely triumphant that the lot had fallen to her. To act at the college anniversary was a great honor, and Dorothy knew that Hope Lawson and Valentine Barnett, neither of whom was included this time, would have been only too delighted to have her chance. "They envy me ever so much, and it will make them extra censorious," she thought. "They'll turn up their noses dreadfully if I only wear a costume of sateen and art muslin." To Dorothy, who had not yet forgotten her disappointment at losing the election for the wardenship, and who was always on the defensive against real or imaginary slights, this occasion of the festival seemed a unique opportunity of asserting her position in the school. She knew, from former experience, how the girls discussed and criticized the dresses worn by the players, and what elaborate and expensive costumes were often provided. Many beautiful accessories in the way of scenery were generally lent by parents of the pupils, and the whole performance was on a very handsome scale. To be one of the maskers in this year's pageant would increase her social standing, and magnify her importance in her form as nothing else could possibly do. She pictured the triumph of the scene, the select company of picked actors on the platform, the music, the flowers, and the lovely effects of color grouping. The large lecture hall would be filled to overflowing with pupils and guests. Alison's uncle would no doubt be there, and Percy and Eric Helm. She would like them to see her as Queen of the Daffodils. She might give 3 performers invitations, so she could ask Dr. and Mrs. Longton as well as Aunt Barbara. Oh, it would be the event of her life. But how was all this to happen if she could not be provided with a suitable costume? What it comes to is this, she said to herself. The thing, to be done at all, ought to be done well. The girls will laugh at me if I turn up in sateen, with 6pence halfpenny bunches of daffodils. I'd rather not act if I can't have a nice dress. Aunt Barbara might manage it somehow. Dorothy did her lessons in her den that evening, although there was no fire and the weather was still cold. She came down to supper so moody and unresponsive that Miss Sherborne, after a vain attempt at conversation, gave up the effort, and the meal passed almost in silence. The subject of the mask was not mentioned by either. Dorothy cried bitterly in bed that night, hot scalding tears of disappointment, tears that did not soften and relieve her grief, but only made it harder to bear, and she woke next morning with a splitting headache. "Have you finished with this book, Auntie?" she said after breakfast, taking up the ill-fated catalogue of costumes, which had been left the night before on the sideboard. "You might leave it for a day or 2, if Miss Hicks can spare it," replied Miss Sherborne. "There is still plenty of time before May the 12th. "What's the matter with Dorothy?" said Mavi Morris that morning at school. "She's so glum and cross, one can't get a civil word from her. When I mentioned the pageant, she nearly snapped my head off." "Tantrums again, I suppose," said Ruth Harmon, shrugging her shoulders. "The best plan is to leave her alone till she comes out of them. You ought to know Dorothy Greenfield by this time." "You shouldn't tease her," said Grace Russell. "I didn't. I only asked her what her dress was to be like, and she told me to mind my own business. All those who are acting are just full of their costumes. They talk of nothing else." "Is Dorothy's going to be a nice one?" asked Ruth. "I don't know, she wouldn't tell me anything. Dorothy doesn't generally have handsome things, does she?" "No, she's one of the plainest dressed girls in the form. But she'll surely come out in something decent for the mask. She must, you know." "Perhaps that's the rub, poor Dorothy," murmured Grace Russell. When Dorothy returned home that afternoon, she found Miss Sherborne busy at her writing table. Generally all papers were cleared away before tea time, and Aunt Barbara was ready to help with lessons, or play games and chat afterwards. Today, however, she instituted a new regime. "I am going to write in the evenings now," she said, "so you must be quiet, dear, and not disturb me. I have a piece of work that I particularly want to finish." Dorothy prepared her German translation and learned her Latin vocabularies, then, taking up a volume of Scott, began to read. It was rather dull, with only the scratching of Aunt Barbara's pen to break the silence. She missed their usual game of chess and their pleasant talk. It seemed so extraordinary not to be allowed to say a single word. The next evening and the next the program was the same. Except at meal times, Dorothy hardly had the opportunity of exchanging ideas with Aunt Barbara. She did not like the innovation. "Auntie does nothing but write, write, write the whole time," she complained to Martha. "Yes, she's overdoing it entirely, and I've told her so," returned Martha indignantly. "She's at it from morning till night, and then she's not finished, for she's sitting up to the small hours. There's no sense in fagging like that. You can't burn a candle at both ends." "Then why does she?" questioned Dorothy. "That's what I asked her. She's not strong enough to stand it. She's been ill again lately, and if she doesn't mind she'll have a breakdown." "Auntie, won't you go to bed early too?" suggested Dorothy, as she said good night, looking rather anxiously at the pale face bent over the papers. Miss Sherborne put her hand to her head wearily. "I can't. I must make a push and put in a certain number of hours' work, or these articles will never be finished in time. If I can send them in by the 2nd, and they are accepted, I may possibly get a check for them at once. That would just give us time before the 12th. We can't buy silks and satins without the wherewithal, can we?" "Oh, Auntie! Are you slaving like this for me?" exclaimed Dorothy. "Can't we get the dress any other way?" "No, dear, I can't afford it out of the housekeeping money, and it is one of my rules never to run into debt for anything. Don't worry, another day will see me through, and I think the editor of the Coalminster Gazette will like the articles. They are better than the ones he accepted last year." Dorothy went upstairs uneasy and dissatisfied with herself. Aunt Barbara's good-night kiss had roused something that had been slumbering for a long time. Thoughts that the girl had suppressed lately began to make themselves heard, and to clamour loudly and reproachfully. She tried to put them away, but they refused to be dismissed. With her eyes shut tight in bed, she seemed to see a vision of Aunt Barbara's tired face as she sat working so painfully hard in the sitting room below. "And for me, always for me, never for herself," reflected Dorothy. "She hasn't bought a new dress of her own this spring, though she needs one badly. She looked with compunction next morning at Miss Sherborne's pale cheeks. "Does your head ache, Auntie?" "Yes. I haven't been quite well lately, but I expect it will pass. You shall buy me some phenestrine powders in town, they always do my head good." Dr. Longton recommended them. "She looks more fit to be in bed than at her writing table," thought Dorothy, as she left the room, armed with the necessary prescription. She hurried away from school at 4 o'clock in order to give herself time to call at the chemist's, and ran anxiously into the house on her return, bearing the packet of powders in triumph. "Shoo! Shoo! Don't make a noise," said Martha, coming from the kitchen. "Your aunt's lying down. I told her it would come to this, and I've proved my words. It's an attack of her old complaint. It always comes back with overwork." "Is she really very ill?" faltered Dorothy. "I don't know. I've just sent Jones's boy with a message for Dr. Longton." "No, you mustn't go disturbing her till he's been. Take your things off, and I'll bring you your tea." Dorothy ate her solitary meal in sad distress. She could remember 2 former illnesses of Aunt Barbara's, and she was old enough now to realize how much cause there was for alarm. She waylaid the doctor on his arrival, and begged him to allow her to be of help. "If Auntie is really going to be ill like she was before, let me be her nurse," she implored. "I learned a great deal at the ambulance classes, and I'd carry out every single thing you told me." "We'll see. I must examine my patient first," replied her old friend. Dorothy sat on the stairs waiting with a beating heart while Dr. Longton was in Miss Sherborne's room. She sprang up eagerly as he came out, and accompanied him over the porch. She hardly dared to ask for his verdict. "Yes, it's a nasty return of the old trouble," said the doctor. "I'm afraid she's in for a sharp attack, but luckily I was sent for in good time, and may be able to stave things off a little." "So you're anxious to try your hand at nursing, young woman? Well, I don't see why you shouldn't. You and Martha can manage quite well between you, if you'll only carry out my directions absolutely to the letter." "When I suggested sending for a trained nurse, your aunt was very much against the idea, begged me not to, in fact. Martha has a head on her shoulders, and you're not a child now." "I shall soon be 15, said Dorothy, drawing herself to her full height. "Well, here's your chance to show what you're worth. If you can manage in this emergency, I shall have some opinion of you. I can telephone to the nursing institution if I find it's too much for you." "I hope that won't be necessary," replied Dorothy. In that 1 hour she seemed to have suddenly grown years older, and to have taken up a new burden of responsibility. Martha hardly knew her when she entered the sick room. She seemed so unwontedly calm and resourceful, yet withal so gentle, so tactful, and so deft and clever in doing all that was required for the invalid. "I'd no idea the bairn could be so helpful," murmured Martha to herself. If she goes on as well as she shapes, we'll do without a nurse, and that'll ease Miss Sherborne's mind. She can't afford 2 guineas a week, let alone the woman's keep, and it would worry her to think of the expense. As far as I'm concerned, I don't want a nurse in the house, making extra trouble and what waste goodness knows. The first thing Dorothy did when she could be spared from Aunt Barbara's room is to find her blotter and write a letter to Vera Norland. It ran thus: Dear Vera, can you take the part of Queen of the Daffodils instead of me? My aunt is very ill, and I am afraid I shall not be able to come to school for a while, so I shall miss the rehearsals. I thought I had better let you know at once, so that you will have time to get your dress. Sincerely yours, Dorothy Greenfield. She ran out herself and posted the letter, then came back and quietly sat down again by Aunt Barbara's bedside. It cost her a great pang thus to give up her part in the festival, but once the irrevocable step was taken, and the letter in the pillar box, she felt much better. You've just got to forget about that pageant, Dorothy Greenfield, she said to herself. You've been behaving abominably lately, and I'm thoroughly ashamed of you. Now's your chance indeed, as the doctor says. I only hope it hasn't come too late. Oh, you nasty, ungrateful, selfish, thoughtless thing, how I despise you. As Dr. Longton had anticipated, Miss Sherborne had a sharp attack of her former complaint. For a week she lay very ill, and her 2 devoted nurses hardly left her day or night. It was a new experience to Dorothy to have Aunt Barbara, who had been accustomed to do everything for her, lying helpless and dependent upon her care. It brought out the grit in the girl's character, and made her see many things to which she had before been blind. Hitherto Dorothy had not been at all zealous at helping in the house, but now she cheerfully washed plates and dishes, and did many other tasks that were distasteful to her. As one that serveth, she often said to herself as she went about the daily duties, trying to take her fair share of the trouble and help poor, faithful Martha, whose devotion never slackened. She wore the little badge of the guild constantly, that its remembrance might be always with her. As one that serveth, Miss Tempest said that the motto ought to mean so much in one's life, she thought. I didn't understand before, but I do now. When Auntie gets better, I'm going to be very different. It was a joyful day for Martha and Dorothy when the doctor pronounced Miss Sherborne out of danger. She has made a wonderful recovery, he said, and if she only takes proper care of herself she ought to get on nicely now. She has had a splendid pair of nurses. Honestly, Dorothy, I never thought you would be able to manage without professional help. You've done very well, child, very well indeed. Dorothy's eyes were full of tears. I'm sorry you were disappointed, darling. Auntie, it's not that, please don't misunderstand me. Ever since you were ill I've wanted to tell you that I know now what a nasty, ungrateful wretch I've been. You've been working and toiling for me all these years, and I took it just as a matter of course, and never thought how much you were giving up for me. I'm going to work for you now. I'm afraid I can't do much at first, with money, I mean, but I'll try my hardest at the coal, and perhaps in a year or two I may be a help instead of a burden." "A burden you have never been, child," said Miss Sherborne. "If I had only got well a little sooner, we would have made you the costume. I sent the articles off the afternoon I was taken ill, and a cheque for them came a week ago." "Then you must spend it on yourself, please." "No, I'm glad the daffodil dress wasn't made. I should always have hated myself for having it." "But you've missed the whole festival," regretted Aunt Barbara. "Never mind, it's May Day here as well as at Avondale. Look at the lilac and the columbines, and this bowl of wallflowers. The air is so sweet and soft now, and there's a thrush's nest in the garden. All the harsh winds and the cold seem to be gone, and summer has come." "Yes, summer has indeed come," said Aunt Barbara, gazing, not at the flowers, but at Dorothy's face, where a new, softened look had replaced the old frown of discontent.